And everybody's muted. And let me share my screen because we're starting chapter 2. Okay. So last week's class ended chapter 1, and I read the intro to chapter 2, what it's going to be talking about, and so let's, yeah. So if you don't mind, I'll do the bracha, and I'll just start over again with the intro. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. This chapter discusses those occasions in which one performs an activity on his own property and thereby causes damage to his neighbor. Okay? There are certain types, some actions cause immediate damage to the property of another. In other situations, the damage is not immediate. There are certain types of damage that are tangible, while others are intangible. An analysis of these issues raises several fundamental questions. Is it correct to say that in general there's a principle that it's the responsibility of the one who has the potential to cause damage to distance himself from another's property or person in order to ensure that he avoids causing damage? Or does an individual generally have the right to do as he pleases on his own property, and it's the neighbor's responsibility to distance himself if he's likely to sustain damage? This leads to a further issue. If one distances his activities from his neighbor so as not to cause damage, is he entitled to compensation, or is he simply fulfilling an obligation for which he does not receive payment? Yet another dilemma concerns a case where one took precautions to avoid causing damage to another, and nevertheless, his activity damaged his neighbor's property. Do his efforts serve to exempt him from responsibility, or must he still pay damage for the damage he caused? And then damaging your neighbor's property could also damage public property. Okay, so that should be interesting stuff to talk about. Okay, so the Mishnah. A person, let's just see if I can make this just a little bit bigger. Okay. A person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another in order to avoid damaging the latter's pit. Okay, so you're digging a pit. Usually it's a cistern. Okay, I guess it could be a storage pit, but usually it could be a cistern too. Let me just see. There's a note here for digging. The commentaries disagree with regard to the reason for this restriction. While the Gemara states that the concern is about the moisture that seeps from the various pits, on a different page, the Gemara indicates that the construction of the pit itself weakens the ground. Okay. So you can't dig a pit close to the pit of another. Just a second. In order to avoid damaging the latter's pit. And similarly, so that's assuming that the other pit is already in existence, and you're digging a pit, knowing that there's another pit there already. Okay? So if there's already a pit, you have to know that there's a certain distance that you have to keep from it in order to ensure the integrity of both of that pit that's already there and your pit. Okay? And similarly, one may not dig a ditch, nor a cave, that is a covered pit, nor a water channel, nor a launderer's pond, which is a pit used for washing clothes, unless he distanced all of these three hand breadths from the wall of another, and he plasters lime on the place where there is water. So, according to the Mishnah, so I don't know how, what kind of structural engineers or construction engineers the rabbis were, but 3 handbreadths is all you need. So a handbreadth, again, is just this, right? The four fingers. So three of these is not that much distance. As long as you're plastering lime to ensure there's no leakage, it just has to be 3 handbreadths apart. Okay. And one must distance the soil residue of produce that has been pressed free of its soil. So let's just do the background there. There's the launderer's pond. A solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil. A Gefet refers to the refuse that remains once the oil has been pressed out of olives or sesame seeds. This refuse was usually fed to animals. The substance and moistness of the refuse can cause the refuse to ferment, which can generate heat in the absence of ventilation. At this stage, it's even possible for the refuse to catch fire. Okay, so one must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil. For example, the refuse of olives from which oil has been squeezed, and animal manure, and salt, and lime, and rocks, 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, or as all these items produce heat and can damage as all these items can produce heat and can damage the wall. Yes, Julian.
Is the assumption that the land that's being dug up is owned by the digger?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that is the assumption. So let's say, so Michael is sitting here next to me. So let's say the separation between Michael and me would be the separation of our properties. So even though, let's say my property abuts Michael's property, and he might have a pit that's right at the edge of his property. If the pit is already there, I have to dig my pit at least 3 handbreadths away and make sure that if it's a pit that's going to have water in it, that I properly plaster it. Now, that would be the same case for Michael, especially the closer it is to my property, the more important it is that his pit be plastered also, so that if there's damage to his pit, the water doesn't leak into my property. Okay? So then the paragraph goes on, or alternatively, just one second here, he may plaster the wall with lime to prevent damage. One must likewise distance seeds, that is, one may not plant seeds and one may not operate the plow, and one must eliminate urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. Okay? So, damaging, seeping things have to stay at least 3 handbreadths away. The Mishnah continues, and one must distance a mill from a neighbor's wall by 3 handbreadths from the lower stone of the mill, which is 4 handbreadths from the smaller upper stone of the mill. So, just one second here. The mill, there we go. You see the difference between the lower millstone and the upper stone in that picture. And there must be a distance of 3 handbreadths from the protruding base of an oven until the wall, which is 4 handbreadths from the narrow upper rim of the oven. So here's a picture of an oven and how far it has to be from a wall for safety reasons, okay, and not to cause damage to somebody's property. Okay, so we're talking about pits and ponds. We're talking about millstones, refuse, etc. Anything that can cause damage from one's property to another. Okay, so now the Gemara on this. The Tana of the Mishnah, that is the rabbi who taught this Mishnah, opens by speaking of a pit. A person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another, and yet he ends with a reference to a wall. unless he distances it from the wall of another. Let the Tana teach, unless he distanced his pit or ditch 3 handbreadths from the pit of another, just as he begins his statement by referring to a pit. Why does the Mishnah suddenly mention a wall here? Abaye said, and some said it was Rav Yehuda who said, we learned that the Mishnah means from the wall of his pit. In other words, one should read the Mishnah as follows. Unless he distanced his pit or ditch 3 handbreadths from the wall of another's pit. The neighbor also built his pit close to the border between the 2 properties, and the Mishnah is teaching that the one digging a pit must distance it 3 handbreadths from the wall of the pit of the other. All right, so apparently there were walls around pits, and the question for the Gemara is, why doesn't the Mishnah mention the fact that there is a wall around the pit? Okay, the Gemara challenges, but even so, let it teach, unless he distanced his excavations 3 handbreadths from the pit of another. And one would understand that the term pit is referring to the wall of the other's pit. Okay, so pit isn't pit. Pit understands that there's a wall around the pit. The Gemara responds, by using the phrase from the wall of another, this teaches us incidentally that the wall of a pit must be at least 3 handbreadths thick, as the wall of the other's pit occupied the full 3 handbreadths between the cavity of his pit and the property of his neighbor. The practical difference of this observation is with regard to buying and selling, as it's taught in a Braita, with regard to one who says to another, I am selling you a pit and its walls. The wall of the pit must be at least 3 handbreadths thick. Okay, so discussion there just about the idea, even though the Mishnah doesn't say it, it's understood that there's a wall, a 3 handbreadth wall that is around, that should be built around pits.
That means
Yeah.
that if I'm digging a pit on my land, I must dig it 3 handbreadths from my border.
No. And I think it means that if you consider building a pit along the border of your, along the boundary of your property with your neighbor's property, then you have to be sure that there's at least 3 handbreadths space between the pit and your neighbor's property so that you can build the wall that needs to be built around the pit. But if your pit is closer to your home, far away, like more than 3 handbreadths away from somebody else's property, it's unclear to me whether you need to build a wall around your pit.
I don't know if this will come up later, but if I build the pit on my land,
Yeah.
and I build it so that my side of the pit wall is on the property line, am I thereby taking 3 handbreadths of my neighbor's land?
No.
Because now,
You're not supposed to.
Right, so I have to build
A wall.
3 handbreadths
That's right.
inside my own.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Yeah, I think that is just understood, and I think that, it's like building a fence on on one's property today for whatever reason, whether it's a privacy fence or a fence to keep a dog in. You have to build a fence not on the edge of your property, but in your property.
If it's my fence.
Right, if it's your fence that you're building, unless you want to combine with your neighbor and build a fence, then you can build it on the edge, on the actual boundary line itself. But otherwise, you have to build it inside the boundary line. Right?
Looking at it the other way,
Yeah.
if I build 3 handbreadths inside my property line, if I
Yes.
dig 3 handbreadths,
Yes.
then my neighbor can dig his pit to the property line and use my 3 handbreadths.
Oh, that's interesting. So I don't know. I don't know if the Gemara will get into that.
Well, going back to what we did in the beginning, are they going to
Uh-huh.
say that it can be half and half? because of the way we built other walls.
So the wall we talked about in chapter 1 was a dividing wall to equally divide property. This is a retaining wall that has to be built to ensure the integrity of the pit, that it doesn't damage the neighbor's property. Can the neighbor take advantage of the other neighbor's wall and use that as his wall?
I have a feeling I'm getting ahead of the game.
I don't know. Yeah, so it might be discussed. Okay. So
I have
now,
a question.
yes, go ahead, Steve.
Is there anything significant to the 3 hand breaths versus 5 or 10 or whatever?
I don't know. Again, so that it gets to my question about how were the rabbis structural engineers to know that 3 hand breadths was the minimum width for a wall to have integrity to protect the pit. So I don't know. Nobody has yet seemed to raise an objection to the 3 to say, well, I think 2's enough, depending on what you build it with, or 3 is definitely not enough. It has to be 4 or 5. So I don't know if that discussion is going to come up, but if it doesn't come up, then I think they know that 3 hand breadths is what it needs to be.
So it's not based on any theological.
No. There's no theological sense to this. This is very practical. What the minimum is. I guess it's like the building codes. You could, if the building code says that you need at least this kind of material and this width of material, then most builders are going to do the at least, as opposed to spending more money and doing more, right? So this, I think, is an at least. It has to be at least 3 hand breadths. If you want to do more, you do more, but you're using up property to, space in your property for this wall. Yes, Steve?
The fact they use 3 hand breadths as opposed to 3 cubits or 3 centimeters, didn't they have some more objective measure of distance?
Interesting. Probably the Romans did, and the rabbis would use Roman measurements too, and sometimes they do, like mile, or they use Persian ones, parasang. I have no idea what those distances are. They use liquid measures. They do solid volume measures. So this distance, why do they use cubit and handbreadth as opposed to something like inches or the whatever equivalent would have been in their time?
Handbreadth is arbitrary.
Handbreadth is, yes, and so is a cubit. So a cubit is the distance from your elbow to the end of your middle finger. And, different people have different, so it's usually 18 inches is the standard cubit. So Steve, you raise a good question. I don't know why they aren't more precise using Roman, like the Mishnah would use Roman or even Greek measurements. I don't know. Okay, so now this red S. It was stated with regard to one who comes to dig any of these excavations or place any of the items listed in the Mishnah close to the boundary of his field, where his neighbor currently has no pit. Abaye says he may dig or place them close to the boundary, and Rava says he may not dig or place them close to the boundary. Right. So in other words, if you have a choice if I have a choice to dig a pit and Michael has no pit on his property, can I dig my pit close to the boundary line? Like, why would I choose to do that? To threaten the integrity of my pit and to threaten the integrity of Michael's property? Why don't I just want to be safer and just build it closer to my property, where even if there were an accident with the pit, the damage then to Michael's property would be minimal to non-existent. What's the point of me like doing something like that to potentially cause damage? So Abaye says, I can do it because it's my property. I could do whatever I want on my property, wherever I want on my property. But Rava says, no, you shouldn't do it close to the boundary line. So why does Abaye say I can do it wherever I want? And Rava says no. The Gemara explains, all agree that he may not dig or place them close to a field of his neighbor if that field is designated for digging pits, as he will thereby restrict his neighbor from using his field in the manner it is expected to be used. When they disagree, it's with regard to a field that is not designated for digging pits. So in other words, so let's say Michael's field is not for agriculture, but it is going to be for digging pits, whether it's for a laundry pond, storage, refuse, cistern, whatever it is. That's all you can do with your field. And, you could make money off of it because you could, it could be like a silo. You could charge for people to dump on your property or use the laundry pond on your property, whatever it is. So you can make money off of these pits. So if Michael has a field full of pits, then the question is, should I build my pit close to his pit? And the answer, Gemara says both of them would say no. That what they disagree about is whether Michael's field is not designated for pits. Can I then build my pit close to his boundary? There are those who say a different version of this discussion. All agree that one may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary of a field that is not designated for digging pits. When they disagree, it's with regard to a field that is designated for digging pits. Abaye said one may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary, and this is the halacha, even according to the opinion of the rabbis, who say in the Mishnah, coming up on 25b, one must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern, lest the roots of the tree grow and damage a neighbor's cistern in his field. The difference is that there it's prohibited, as when he plants the tree, there's already a cistern. But here, at the time when he digs his cistern, there is as yet no cistern in his neighbor's field. All right, so we have to know what's going on in each other's fields to know what can be planted, what can be dug. Okay, and Rava says one may not dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary, and this is the halacha, even according to the opinion Rabbi Yosei, who says in that same Mishnah, this one may dig in his field, and that one may plant in his field. That is, one need not distance his tree for fear of damaging his neighbor's field through expanding roots. The reason that Rava maintains that his ruling is correct, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, is that this matter applies only there, as when he plants the tree, its roots, which might damage the cistern, are not yet present. Consequently, when he plants, he does not cause any damage. But here the neighbor can say to him, each and every strike of yours with the hoe loosens my earth, and therefore you are already causing damage as you dig your cistern. All right, so if Michael already has cisterns, that then presents a situation that impacts what I'm allowed to do. Because then I have to take into account what's already in existence in Michael's field. But if he doesn't have cisterns there yet, then I can plant my tree on my boundary and I can plant my cistern in my property without having to worry, because there's nothing there that's going to cause damage. Even though there might be potential damage, it doesn't matter. You don't plan for potential damage, you plan for what's there already. That's what Rava says. The Gemara suggests a proof. We learned in the Mishnah that a person may not dig a pit close to the pit of another unless he does so at a distance of 3 handbreadths from his neighbor's wall. The Gemara analyzes this statement. Apparently, the reason he may not dig close to the boundary of his neighbor's field is that there is a pit there, from which it may be inferred that if there is no pit, he may dig his pit close to his neighbor's wall. Granted, according to that second version of the dispute in which you said, all agree that one may dig these excavations or place these items close to the boundary of a field that's not designated for digging pits, one can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a field that's not designated for digging pits. But according to that first version of the dispute, in which you said that they disagree with regard to a field that is not designated for digging pits, there's a difficulty. Granted, this works out well according to the opinion of Abaye, who says that one may dig one's pit near the boundary when the neighbor has no pit. But according to the opinion of Rava, who maintains that it's prohibited to dig a pit near the boundary under any circumstances, the ruling of this Mishnah is difficult. The Gemara explains, Rava could have said to you, wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Abaye says, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who says, we learned that the Mishnah means from the wall of his pit? This indicates that the neighbor must distance the edge of his pit from the boundary by the thickness of his wall, which is 3 handbreadths. Therefore, even according to the ruling of the Mishnah, one may not dig his pit directly adjacent to the boundary. There are those who say this discussion in the form of a challenge to the opinion of Abaye. The Mishnah teaches that one must distance his pit from that of his neighbor, and it was stated with regard to that ruling that Abaye says, and some say it was Rav Yehuda who says, we learned that it means from the wall of his pit. In other words, the edge of the neighbor's pit must be 3 handbreadths away from the boundary. Granted, according to that first version of the dispute, in which you said all agree that he may not dig or place them close to a field of his neighbor, if that field is designated for digging pits, one can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a field that is designated for digging pits. But according to that second version of the dispute, in which you said that they disagree with regard to a field that is designated for digging pits, there's a difficulty. Granted, this works out well according to the opinion of Rava, who says that it's prohibited to dig a pit near the boundary in this case. But according to the opinion of Abaye, the ruling of this Mishnah is difficult, as if the Mishnah is referring to the wall of the neighbor's pit. This indicates that the first pit was dug close to the boundary. The Gemara explains, Abaye could have said to you, the Mishnah is referring to the specific case where both neighbors came to dig their pits at the same time. Consequently, they must both distance their pits from one another. If there's no pit as yet next to the boundary, and the neighbor is not digging at that point, one may dig his pit alongside the boundary. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraita. In the case of rock that is so soft that it crumbles in one's hands, and no tool is needed, this one may dig his pit from here, and that one may dig his pit from there. This one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime, and that one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime. This indicates that the first one who digs a pit must distance his pit even when the second one does not yet have a pit. The Gemara rejects this proof. Rock that crumbles in one's hands is different. In this case, one must maintain a distance from the boundary due to the softness of the ground. The Gemara is puzzled by this exchange. And he who asked it, why did he ask it? The Baraita is explicitly referring to rock that crumbles in one's hands. So this is clearly a unique case. The Gemara answers that the sage who asked the question assumed that the halacha of the Baraita includes all types of soil, and he thought that it was necessary for the Tana to mention the specific example of rock that crumbles in one's hands, as it could enter your mind to say that since this substance crumbles in one's hands, he is required to keep his pit at an even greater distance. To counter this, the Baraita teaches us that a distance of 3 handbreadths is sufficient. So even in very loose, crumbly soil, 3 handbreadths is a sufficient distance in that case. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. One must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, and animal manure, and salt and lime, and rocks 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. Or he can plaster the wall with lime. The Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall there belonging to his neighbor, from which it may be inferred that there is no wall, that if there is no wall there, one may place these substances close to the boundary of his neighbor's courtyard. This presents a difficulty for the opinion of Rava, according to the first version of the dispute, which states that one may not place these substances close to a boundary, even in the case of a field that is not designated for pits. The Gemara rejects this proof. No, even if there is no wall, one may also not place these substances close to the boundary. The Gemara asks, rather, what does mentioning a wall here teach us? The Gemara answers, this teaches us that all these substances are damaging to a wall. The Gemara suggests, come and hear another proof from the Mishnah. One must distance seeds and the plow and urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. The Gemara analyzes this ruling. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall from which it may be inferred that if there is no wall, one may place these substances close to the boundary of the field. The Gemara rejects this proof as well. No, even if there is no wall, one may also not place these substances close by the boundary. The Gemara asks, but rather, what does this teach us? The Gemara answers, this teaches us that dampness is damaging to a wall. The Gemara suggests, come and hear another proof from the Mishnah. And one must distance a mill from a wall by 3 handbreadths from the lower stone of the mill, which is 4 handbreadths from the upper stone. The Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall from which it may be inferred that if there is no wall, one may place a mill close by the boundary. The Gemara rejects this proof. No, even if there is no wall, one may also not place his mill close by the boundary. The Gemara asks, but rather, what does this teach us? The Gemara answers, this teaches us that vibrations are damaging to a wall. The Gemara suggests, come and hear another proof from the Mishnah. And the oven must be distanced 3 handbreadths from the base, which is 4 handbreadths from the upper rim of the oven. The Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason for this ruling is that there is a wall from which it may be inferred that if there is no wall, one may place an oven close by the boundary. The Gemara rejects this proof as well. No, even if there is no wall, one may also not place his oven close by the boundary. The Gemara asks, rather, what does this teach us? The Gemara answers, that teaches us that heat is damaging to a wall. Okay, so we've learned that moisture, vibrations, and heat are damaging to a wall. The Gemara suggests, yes? The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. A person may not open a bakery or a dye shop beneath the wine storeroom of another, nor may one open a cattle barn there. Okay, so a person owns a storeroom on the 2nd floor of a building. So the storeroom is there. The bottom floor becomes available. It cannot be available for a bakery or a dye shop or a cattle barn. Okay, so you got a wine storeroom on the 2nd floor. You can't have a bakery beneath it, a dye shop beneath it, or a cattle barn. So the Gemara analyzes this Mishnah. The reason for this ruling is that there is a storeroom already in place, from which it may be inferred that if there is no storeroom, one may do so. If this is the case, then with regard to a pit as well, one may dig next to a boundary if there is as yet no pit. The Gemara answers, the case of a residence is different, as in general one can use his domicile in any manner of his choosing, unless he directly causes damage to another or his property. The Gemara adds, the language of the Mishnah is also precise, as an explicit baraita is taught with regard to that Mishnah. If the construction of the cattle barn preceded the storeroom, it is permitted. Nothing can be inferred from the case of the baraita with regard to the halacha of the Mishnah, which does not concern living quarters. The Gemara suggests, come and hear proof from a Mishnah. A person may not plant a tree close to another's field unless he distances it 4 cubits from his neighbor. And it is taught with regard to this Mishnah. The 4 cubits of which the sages spoke are to enable the work of the vineyard, that is, a small space next to the trees is necessary to enable animals to plow between them. The Gemara analyzes this ruling. The reason this distance is required is due to the work of the vineyard, from which it may be inferred that if not for the problem due to the work of the vineyard, it would be permitted for one to plant his tree close to the boundary. And apparently this is the halacha, even though there are roots of the tree that damage his neighbor's field. The Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We're dealing with a case where a hard rock interrupts between the 2 fields, preventing the roots from passing through to the other field. The Gemara continues, the language of the Mishnah is also precise with regard to this point, as it teaches further on. If there was a fence between them, this one places, that is, plants a tree close to the fence from here, and that one places, that is, plants a tree close to the fence from here. If the Mishnah were referring to a case where the roots could travel across, how could it be permitted for both neighbors to plant their trees alongside each other? Consequently, it must be referring to a situation where a rock separates between the 2 fields below, and therefore the neighbors may plant their trees near the fence. The Gemara responds, if so, say the last clause of that Mishnah. If the roots of the tree extended into the field of another, the neighbor may cut them off to a depth of 3 handbreadths so that they do not impede the plow. The Gemara asks, but if a rock interrupts between the 2 fields and forms a barrier, what are these roots doing there? That is, how did they get there? The Gemara answers, this is what the Tana of the Mishnah is saying. And if there is no rock, and the roots of the tree extended into the field of another, the neighbor may cut them off to a depth of 3 handbreadths, so that they do not impede the plow. All right, so there's a difference of opinion and not unanimity about how close things can be to neighbors' property. Is it dependent upon whether what's there already, or is it dependent upon roots extending into neighbors' property? Do you have to worry about that or no? So there's a difference of opinion so far about these matters. The Gemara suggests, come and hear proof from a Mishnah. One must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern. The Gemara analyzes this halacha. The reason for this ruling is that there is a cistern from which it may be inferred that if there is no cistern, one may place, that is, plant his tree close to his neighbor's field. The Gemara answers, no, even when there is no cistern, one may also not place it close to the neighbor's field. And by mentioning a cistern, the Tana of the Mishnah teaches us this, that the roots of a tree extend and damage the cistern up to a distance of 25 cubits away. So that's like 37 feet, right? If a cubit is 1.5 feet, so 25 times 1.5. No, I don't know what that is. 37.5 feet. Okay. The Gemara asks, if so, say the last clause of that Mishnah. So that's a mathematical formula that I was able to do pretty quickly. So I don't always do that. Okay, and so the Gemara asks, if so, say the last clause of that Mishnah, and if the tree preceded the cistern, one is not required to cut down the tree. But if one may not place the tree close to the boundary, even if there is no cistern, how can you find a case where the tree preceded the cistern? why would its owner not be required to cut it down? The Gemara answers, this is, as Rav Papa says, with regard to a similar matter, that it's referring to a buyer who purchases part of a field. So to here, it's referring to a buyer. In other words, a field contained a cistern and tree alongside each other, and the owner sold the part of the field containing the cistern. The Gemara, so in other words, one owner has both a field, a tree, and a cistern closer than 25 cubits apart. And then for some reason needs to sell part of that field, and he sells, like he splits the distance between the cistern and the tree. In that case, then you have the situation in which you have to be concerned, because you might still own the tree, but now somebody else owns the cistern. You might have to cut down the tree because somebody else owns the cistern. The Gemara cites yet another source. Come and hear a proof from a Mishnah. One must distance the water in which flax is steeped from vegetables growing in a neighbor's field, and one must distance leeks from onions growing in a neighbor's field, and one must likewise distance mustard from bees that are in a neighbor's field. The Gemara analyzes this statement. The reason is that there are vegetables present from which it may be inferred that if there are no vegetables, one may place the water close to the neighbor's field. The Gemara rejects this opinion. No, even if there are no vegetables, one may not place the water close to the neighbor's field. And the Tana teaches us that these items mentioned in that Mishnah are harmful to each other. The Gemara responds, if so, say that the last clause of that Mishnah, Rabbi Yosei renders it permitted to plant near the neighbor's bees in the case of mustard, as explained in a Baraita, that this is because he can say to the owner of the bees, just as you say to me, keep your mustard away from my bees, I can say to you, keep your bees away from my mustard, as they come and eat my mustard plants. In other words, you're damaging my property as well. So bees and mustard, so who has to change? And if one may not place an item that might cause damage close to his neighbor's boundary, how can you find a case where each neighbor is damaging the property of the other? Right? It shouldn't have gotten to that point, because neighbors ensure that what they do on their property doesn't damage the other. Rav Papa says this is referring to a buyer who purchased part of his neighbor's field, and it contains a substance or items that might cause damage, for example, the water in which flax is steeped, or mustard. And the other section of the field, the neighbor retained an item or substance that could be damaged. In this manner, it's possible for the item that causes damage to be found near the boundary of the neighbor without one having violated the ruling of the Mishnah. Okay. It's 10:15, and I have to stop here because I have to get ready for my next class. So we'll stop here for today. We have 2 more weeks of Talmud class. Next Sunday's Mother's Day, and so we could have class next Sunday, and then the following Sunday, the 18th, because the following Sunday is Memorial Day weekend, and so no class then, and that's it for this academic year. So 2 more classes after today, and wishing everybody a good rest of the day. Take care all.